Okay, so I ended that last lecture by calculating the variables that we need for our analysis. And so if I go to the end here, we have our self-stigma variable, we have our imposter syndrome variable, we have our minority status variable here, and then we also have our academic anxiety scale. And so I'm actually going to close out this output file, and I'm going to save it first. So I'm going to save as, and I'm going to talk, let's see, predictors of academic anxiety. Um, liability analysis, and descriptives, and I'm going to save that. And so I can close it so that the next set of analyses will show up in a different output file. So first thing I'm going to do is I've already done the t-test for the self-stigma, but I'm going to do it again. So I'm actually going to first thing I want to do is just do a correlation among the three variables to see if they're associated with one another. Sorry, I keep going really fast. So I'm going to go up to Analyze, and I'm going to scroll down to Correlate, and I'm going to go over to Bivariate, and I'm going to now scroll down. So what's nice about SPSS is that it puts all of your calculated variables at the end, so you know exactly where to look for them. So I'm going to take our three continuous variables, or they're all on an interval scale, self-stigma, imposter syndrome, and academic anxiety. And I'm going to put them into my variable window. I'm going to ask it to do a two-tailed test of significance because I'm not really making any hypotheses at this stage. Although theoretically, I would argue that higher self-stigma and imposter syndrome is associated with academic anxiety. And so, I mean, based on that assumption, I could actually make it a one-tailed test. Again, if you look at options, I can ask for means and standard deviations, but I will because I haven't done that yet, so we'll do that. And I'm asking it to flag significant correlations. So I'm going to hit OK. And what we hear here is our mean and standard deviation for self-stigma, imposter syndrome, and academic anxiety. The key is, of course, to remember the scale that these are on. So self-stigma was on a 4-point scale, I think. Let me check on that real quick. Yes. So self-stigma was on a 4-point scale, imposter syndrome was on a 5-point scale, and academic anxiety is on a 4-point scale. So we had a mean of about 1.9 for self-stigma, a pretty high mean of 3.2 for imposter syndrome, and again, a pretty high mean of academic anxiety of 2.8. So if we look at this here, what we're going to see is that there's actually only one correlation that's significant, and that is that there's a significant positive association between imposter syndrome and academic anxiety, but there is not an association between self-stigma and academic anxiety. And that's fine. You'll note that we've lost quite a few subjects here because of missing data. We tried to account for that, but obviously some people just didn't bother to fill in the questionnaires at all, but this is what happens with online studies, unfortunately. Okay, so that's our first analysis. The next thing I want to do is compare means. So we want to see if our minority status versus our majority status students differ in terms of these three outcome measures. So we have our test variables, which are dependent measures. We're going to select those and put these in the box up here. So self-stigma, imposter syndrome, academic anxiety go up here. And then we're going to put minority status, which is our independent measure, into our grouping variable. And again, we need to define the groups, basically telling SPSS what are the values that are associated with each of our groups. So we're going to say group 1 is equal to 0, and I'm just tabbing down, and group 2 is equal to 1. Once I fill that in, I can hit continue. Again, we've looked at this, nothing that we need to do in here. So I'm going to click OK. And the first thing I'm going to look at, like I described earlier, is my Levine's test of equality of variances, just to make sure that there's no statistically significant differences. And interestingly enough, what we're seeing is that while there is a significant difference in perceived self-stigma between our minority and majority groups, with higher self-stigma among the minority status participants, there's actually no difference in imposter syndrome, and there's no difference in academic anxiety. So the one last thing that I can do is I can also look at, you can also do this just so that you can see what it looks like. Put this all into a regression analysis, right? We talked about that. So what we're going to do is scroll down under Analyze to Regression and put it in as a linear regression. And our dependent measure is then, of course, going to be academic anxiety. Now, technically, I can, I'm going to put in, because this is a dichotomous variable, I'm going to hold off on that. I'm just going to put in self-stigma as one independent variable and imposter syndrome as another. Now, we looked at these as bivariate correlations, and those correlations are looking at the associations with your independent variables independently with your dependent variable. And if you recall, when I talked about linear regression, it looks at the association of the two variables together, all right, and also the overlap. So I'm going to click on statistics. I'm actually going to get confidence intervals. I want to get R-squared change. Actually, I want really R-squared. I'm going to get descriptives, and I'm going to leave it at that for now. I'm going to look at my options. Don't need anything in there. Plots, and I'm not going to do anything there. Okay, so I'm going to hit OK, just so you can see what the output looks like here. So basically what it does is it actually provides you with the same correlation matrix that we got earlier, right? But it shows us that there's a significant association between imposter syndrome and academic anxiety, right? We know this because of the significance levels here, right? Which is significance level is 0.000, which is less than 0.05. So we are, we can reject the null hypothesis about that association, and it's in the right direction. And if you recall, I mentioned that when you do a regression analysis, it's going to give you a big R, or what we call the multiple R, and that tells us what's the association between all of the independent variables, so in this case, both imposter syndrome and self-stigma, with our dependent measure or academic anxiety, and it gives us a big R, so a multiple correlation of 0.59. We also get R-squared, so what it's telling us here is that about 35% of the variance in academic anxiety is explained by imposter syndrome and self-stigma, okay? And then it's telling us that that effect is statistically significant, all right? And that's the overall test. Now, of course, what we also need to know is to what extent which of these variables is significant, right? So essentially what this is telling us is what is the impact of imposter syndrome on academic anxiety when self-stigma is in the model, and conversely, what's the effect of self-stigma on academic anxiety when imposter syndrome is in the model. And what we have here is self-stigma has a t-value of negative 0.768, clearly not statistically significant, and we get a p-value that exceeds 0.05, so we're pretty sure that that's not associated. On the other hand, imposter syndrome is very strongly associated with academic anxiety. So that's pretty typical. It's what we would expect, and at least we have something significant and positive to report in our results. It's always nice to have something statistically significant to talk about, and I may run some other analyses off this screen, and the reason they're off is because they're kind of beyond the scope of the study, but I think it's kind of an interesting question that I think should still be asked with the data, and I'll talk to you guys about that on Tuesday or in class. All right.